The forest never forgets. And tonight, you're about to discover why rangers across America are breaking their silence about encounters that shattered their reality forever. Picture this. 2 a.m., frantic knocking at a ranger station. Two women at the door, one bleeding from a bite wound so deep you can see bone. But the bite pattern doesn't match any animal in North America. The teeth marks are too large, too perfectly spaced, too deliberately placed. The injured woman grabs the ranger's wrist and whispers, "It looked like a person, but it moved like something that had never been human." That was just the beginning of 11 encounters that will make you question everything about the wilderness. We're talking about staircases appearing in the middle of nowhere with no structure attached, leading to something at the top that no ranger will discuss. Blood trails from missing hikers, arranged in patterns so deliberate that investigators knew this wasn't an animal attack. This was something with intelligence, something with purpose. You'll hear about the ranger who followed voices calling for help in the dead of night, only to realize one of those voices was his own, calling from somewhere deep in the forest he'd never been. You'll discover why certain clearings are marked as restricted areas, where silence is so complete that even insects refuse to enter, and why personal belongings from decades of missing hikers are found arranged in perfect circles at their centers. These encounters are happening right now, in parks you've probably visited, on trails you've probably walked. The rangers sharing these experiences aren't seeking attention. They're breaking their silence because they can't carry these secrets alone anymore. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because Verified Fears brings you the encounters authorities don't want you to know about. Every week, we dive deeper into the darkness that exists parallel to our everyday world. These are the experiences that change people forever, told by those who lived through them and found the courage to speak. Once you hear these 11 accounts, you'll never look at a tree line the same way again. You'll know the truth every experienced ranger learns. We are not alone out there, and whatever shares those ancient woods with us has been waiting far longer than we've been walking upright. Are you ready to discover what really happens when the sun goes down in America's most remote places? Because there's no going back once you know what the rangers know. Ranger Michael Torres had been stationed at Grant Grove in Kings Canyon National Park for 8 years when the incident happened that would forever change his perspective on what lurked in the wilderness. It was October 15th, 2017. A crisp autumn night when the temperature had dropped to near freezing, and most campers had already packed up and headed home for the season. The park was entering its quiet period, that eerie time when the forest seemed to hold its breath and every sound carried for miles through the thin mountain air. Torres was finishing his evening patrol reports in the small ranger cabin that served as his temporary headquarters during overnight shifts. The cabin sat isolated among the towering sequoias, connected to the main visitor center by a winding dirt road that became treacherous in the dark. He'd grown accustomed to the solitude, even found comfort in it. The forest at night had its own rhythm, its own language of creaking branches and distant animal calls that he'd learned to read like a book over the years. That night felt different from the moment his shift began. The usual symphony of nocturnal sounds was muted, as if the wildlife had collectively decided to remain hidden. Even the ever-present hoot of owls was absent, replaced by an unsettling silence that made Torres check his radio multiple times to ensure it was working properly. He'd experienced quiet nights before, but this felt deliberate, purposeful, like the forest was holding its breath in anticipation of something. Around 2:15 a.m., Torres was reviewing incident reports from the previous week when the first sound shattered the silence. It wasn't the gentle tap of a lost camper or the uncertain knock of someone seeking directions. This was frantic, desperate pounding that echoed through the cabin like gunshots. The urgency in those knocks made his blood run cold before he even reached the door. When Torres opened the heavy wooden door, he found two women standing in the pale glow of his porch light. The first woman, appearing to be in her mid-30s with short brown hair, was supporting her companion, who was clearly in distress. The second woman, younger with long blonde hair, was clutching her left arm against her chest. And even in the dim light, Torres could see dark stains spreading across her jacket sleeve. "Please, you have to help us." The brunette gasped, her breath forming clouds in the cold air. "Something attacked my friend. We've been walking for hours trying to find help." Her voice carried the kind of exhaustion that comes from genuine terror, not the manufactured drama of teenagers playing pranks or the confusion of intoxicated campers who'd lost their way. Torres immediately ushered them inside, his training kicking in as he assessed the situation. The injured woman, who introduced herself as Lisa, was pale and shaking, clearly in shock. Her companion, Sarah, explained that they'd been camping at a dispersed site about 5 miles from the main campground when something had attacked their tent around midnight. As Torres carefully helped Lisa remove her jacket to examine the wound, what he saw defied every bit of wilderness training he'd received. The bite mark on her forearm was unlike anything he'd encountered in his 8 years as a ranger. The puncture wounds were deep, penetrating through muscle nearly to the bone, but their pattern was what truly disturbed him. The bite consisted of 4 distinct puncture marks, arranged in a pattern that suggested canine teeth. But the spacing was all wrong. The marks were too far apart for any wolf, too large for a coyote, and too precisely placed for a bear. Torres had seen hundreds of animal attacks during his career, had been trained to identify bite patterns from every predator species in the Sierra Nevada. But this didn't match anything in his experience or textbooks. What made the wound even more unsettling was its precision. Animal attacks, even from intelligent predators, typically show signs of struggle, tearing, or multiple bite attempts. This appeared to be a single, calculated bite delivered with surgical precision. The edges of the puncture wounds were clean, almost clinical, as if whatever had bitten Lisa had known exactly where to place its teeth for maximum effect, without causing fatal damage. As Torres cleaned and bandaged the wound, Sarah recounted their experience with a trembling voice that suggested she was still processing what had happened. They'd been camping in a small clearing they discovered earlier that day, far from any established trails or campsites. The location had seemed perfect, secluded and peaceful, surrounded by ancient sequoias that created a natural cathedral under the starlight. Around midnight, Sarah had been awakened by what she described as breathing outside their tent. Not the heavy panting of a bear or the quick respirations of a smaller animal, but slow, deliberate breathing that seemed almost human in its rhythm. She'd listened for several minutes, trying to convince herself it was just the wind or her imagination, when the breathing suddenly stopped. The silence that followed was more terrifying than the breathing had been. Sarah lay frozen in her sleeping bag, straining to hear any sound that might indicate what was outside their tent. That's when she heard Lisa gasp and saw the tent wall near her friend's head suddenly indent inward, as if something was pressing against it from outside. Before Sarah could react, Lisa screamed as something grabbed her arm through the tent fabric. The attack lasted only seconds, but Sarah's description of those moments painted a picture that would haunt Torres for years to come. She described seeing a silhouette against the tent wall that appeared human in shape but moved with an unnatural fluidity, like liquid shadow given form. The most disturbing detail of Sarah's account was what happened after the attack. Instead of pursuing them or continuing the assault, whatever had bitten Lisa simply vanished. There was no sound of retreat, no crashing through underbrush or fading footsteps. One moment it was there, the next it was gone, leaving only the metallic scent of blood and a silence so complete it felt oppressive. The women had immediately abandoned their campsite, grabbing only essential items before fleeing into the darkness. They'd hiked for hours through unfamiliar terrain, guided only by Sarah's compass and the desperate hope of finding help. The fact that they'd managed to navigate 5 miles of wilderness in complete darkness, while one of them was injured, spoke to the genuine terror that had driven them from their campsite. Torres radioed for medical assistance and arranged for the women to be transported to the nearest hospital. But his investigation of their campsite the following morning raised more questions than it answered. The location they described was exactly where they'd said it would be, and evidence of their hasty departure was clearly visible. Their abandoned tent, sleeping bags, and camping equipment were scattered around the small clearing, but what Torres found most disturbing was what wasn't there. Despite the soft earth around the campsite and the recent rain that had left the ground perfect for tracking, Torres found no footprints other than those left by the 2 women. He discovered the exact spot where the attack had occurred, marked by drops of Lisa's blood on the tent fabric and surrounding ground. But there were no tracks leading to or away from the location. Torres had tracked everything from black bears to mountain lions throughout his career, and he knew that every animal leaves some trace of its passage. Even the most careful predators disturb vegetation, leave scent marks, or create some evidence of their presence. The complete absence of any such evidence at the campsite was more unsettling than finding strange tracks would have been. The medical report from Lisa's treatment added another layer to the mystery. The emergency room doctor who treated her wound noted the unusual nature of the bite pattern and took detailed photographs for his records. The depth and precision of the puncture wounds suggested an animal with significant jaw strength. But the spacing and angle of the bite didn't match any known species in the region. Most disturbing was the doctor's observation that the bite appeared to have been delivered with restraint. The positioning and depth of the wounds suggested that whatever had bitten Lisa could have easily caused much more severe damage, but had chosen not to. It was as if the attack had been a message or warning rather than a genuine attempt to harm. Torres filed his official report, documenting the incident as an animal attack by an unknown species. But privately, he continued investigating. He spent weeks researching similar incidents, reaching out to other rangers and wildlife biologists across the country. What he discovered was a pattern of similar encounters, always involving bite wounds with the same unusual characteristics, always occurring in remote wilderness areas, and always lacking any physical evidence of the attacker. The incident changed Torres in ways he couldn't fully articulate. He continued his duties as a ranger, but he found himself paying closer attention to the forest's moods, to the subtle changes in wildlife behavior that might indicate the presence of something that didn't belong. He never encountered whatever had attacked Lisa, but he never stopped feeling like it was out there, watching from the shadows between the trees, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself again. Years later, Torres still works at Kings Canyon, but colleagues note that he's different now, more cautious, more aware of the darkness that exists in the spaces between what we know and what we fear. He never speaks publicly about that October night, but those close to him know that it fundamentally changed his understanding of what shares the wilderness with us, and why some mysteries are better left unsolved. Ranger David Chen had been working the night shift at Yellowstone's Lamar Valley for 3 years when he received the call that would become one of the most disturbing cases of his career. It was late September 2019, during the park's shoulder season when visitor numbers dropped dramatically and the wilderness reclaimed its ancient silence. The call came in at 11:47 p.m. from the Emergency Dispatch Center, reporting a family in severe distress at Campsite 23 in the Slough Creek area. Chen drove through the winding mountain roads with a growing sense of unease. Family emergencies in the backcountry usually involved medical issues, bear encounters, or equipment failures. But the dispatcher's voice had carried an unusual tension when relaying the message. The family had specifically requested immediate ranger assistance and refused to leave their campsite until help arrived, which was unusual behavior for campers experiencing typical wilderness problems. When Chen arrived at the designated campsite, he found the Morrison family huddled together inside their large family tent, with every battery-powered lantern they owned blazing around the perimeter. Tom Morrison, a software engineer from Denver, emerged from the tent looking haggard and exhausted despite the early hour. His wife Jennifer remained inside with their 8-year-old son Marcus, who Chen could hear whimpering softly in the background. Tom's account of their experience began normally enough. The family had arrived that afternoon to begin a 3-day camping trip, their first visit to Yellowstone. They'd set up camp in the designated area, cooked dinner over their portable stove, and settled in for what they'd expected to be a peaceful evening under the stars. Marcus had been excited about the possibility of seeing wildlife, and they'd spent the early evening hours scanning the meadows with binoculars, hoping to spot elk or bison in the distance. The first sign that something was wrong came around 9 p.m., when the normal sounds of the wilderness began to fade. Tom, who had some camping experience, noticed that the usual chorus of insects and night birds gradually diminished until an unnatural silence settled over their campsite. Even the distant sounds of the Slough Creek, which had provided a constant background murmur throughout the day, seemed muffled and distant. Jennifer had been the first to notice the shadows. While cleaning up after dinner, she'd caught glimpses of movement in her peripheral vision, dark shapes that seemed to shift and flow just beyond the reach of their campfire light. Initially, she dismissed these as tricks of the flickering flames or her imagination. But as the evening progressed, the movements became more pronounced and deliberate. Tom described how the shadows began to take on more defined shapes around 10 p.m. What had started as vague movements in the darkness gradually resolved into humanoid silhouettes that appeared to be circling their campsite at a distance of roughly 50 yards. The figures moved with an unnatural gait, sometimes upright like humans, other times dropping to all fours and moving with an animal-like fluidity that defied easy categorization. The most disturbing aspect of the encounter was the deliberate nature of the shadows' behavior. Rather than random movement or the purposeful hunting patterns of known predators, these figures seemed to be engaged in some form of coordinated activity. They maintained consistent spacing as they circled the campsite, never approaching closer than 50 yards, but never retreating beyond the edge of visibility. Marcus had been the first to actually count them. With the fearless curiosity of childhood, he'd stood at the tent entrance and systematically counted the moving shapes. "Daddy, there are 7 of them," he'd announced in a matter-of-fact voice that sent chills down both parents' spines. Tom had initially tried to convince his son that he was seeing things, but when he looked carefully, he could indeed distinguish 7 distinct figures maintaining their circular patrol around the campsite. What made the situation even more unsettling was the complete absence of sound from the circling figures. Despite moving through terrain covered with dry leaves, fallen branches, and loose rocks. The shadows made no audible noise. Tom, who had done enough hiking to know that even experienced outdoorsmen struggled to move silently through wilderness terrain, found this silence more frightening than any growl or threatening sound would have been. Jennifer's breaking point came when she realized that the figures were gradually tightening their circle. What had begun as a wide perimeter around their campsite was slowly contracting, with the shadows moving incrementally closer with each circuit. The mathematical precision of their movement suggested intelligence and coordination that went far beyond animal behavior. The family had retreated to their tent around 10:30 p.m., zipping every opening and huddling together while the circling continued outside. Through the tent walls, they could see the shadows of the figures passing regularly, their movements creating shifting patterns of darkness against the fabric. Marcus had begun crying softly, not from fear, but from a deep, instinctive understanding that something fundamentally wrong was happening around them. Tom had tried using his cell phone to call for help, but discovered that he had no signal despite being in an area where he'd had full bars earlier in the day. The complete communication blackout added another layer of isolation to their predicament, cutting them off from any possibility of outside assistance. It was only when Jennifer remembered the emergency satellite communicator they'd rented for the trip that they were able to contact park services. Chen's investigation of the campsite revealed several disturbing details that he documented carefully, but never included in his official report. The ground around the Morrison family's tent showed clear evidence of the circular movement Tom had described. A distinct path had been worn into the earth at exactly 50 yards from their tent, forming a perfect circle that showed signs of repeated use by multiple individuals. What made the path even more unsettling was its precision. The circle was geometrically perfect, with no deviation or irregularity that would be expected from random animal movement or human activity. The depth and consistency of the wear pattern suggested that this circling behavior had been repeated many times, possibly over an extended period, though the Morrisons were the first campers to report witnessing it. Chen found no footprints or other identifying marks along the worn path, despite the soft earth that should have clearly shown any human or animal tracks. The absence of physical evidence was consistent with other unexplained incidents he'd encountered during his tenure at Yellowstone, cases that seemed to exist in the gray area between documented fact and inexplicable phenomenon. The most disturbing discovery came when Chen expanded his search beyond the immediate campsite area. He found similar circular paths around 3 other designated camping spots within a 2-mile radius, all showing the same precise geometry and wear patterns. The implications were deeply unsettling. Whatever had circled the Morrison family was engaged in systematic behavior that extended far beyond a single incident. Chen arranged for the family to be escorted to a hotel outside the park, but the psychological impact of their experience was already evident. Marcus, who had been excited about camping and wildlife before the incident, refused to sleep without lights on and began experiencing nightmares that persisted for months after their return home. Jennifer developed a severe anxiety response to darkness and open spaces that required professional counseling to address. Tom, perhaps the most affected by the experience, became obsessed with researching similar incidents. He spent countless hours online, connecting with other campers and outdoor enthusiasts who reported comparable encounters. What he discovered was a pattern of incidents spanning decades, all involving families or small groups who reported being circled by shadowy figures in remote wilderness areas. The common elements across these reports were remarkably consistent. The perfect circular movement, the complete silence of the figures, the gradual tightening of the perimeter, and the absence of any physical evidence after the fact. Most disturbing was the psychological impact on witnesses, particularly children, who seemed to be more susceptible to long-term trauma from these encounters. Chen continued to investigate the phenomenon privately, visiting the affected campsites regularly and documenting any changes or new evidence. He discovered that the circular paths would gradually fade over time if left undisturbed, but would be renewed whenever new camping activity occurred in the area. This suggested that whatever created the paths was responding to human presence in a calculated and purposeful manner. The ranger's research led him to similar reports from other national parks across the country, always in remote areas with minimal human traffic. The consistency of the accounts across different geographic regions and time periods suggested a phenomenon that was both widespread and persistent, yet somehow remained largely unknown to the general public. Years later, Marcus Morrison still struggles with the psychological aftermath of that September night. Now 11 years old, he continues to experience nightmares about shadowy figures circling in the darkness. His drawings from art therapy sessions consistently feature circular patterns and dark humanoid shapes. Images that his therapist notes are remarkably detailed and consistent for a child's recollection of a traumatic event. The Morrison family never returned to camping, and Tom estimates they've spent thousands of dollars on therapy and treatment for the psychological trauma caused by their single night in Yellowstone. Their experience serves as a stark reminder that some encounters in the wilderness leave wounds that never fully heal, scars that persist long after the physical danger has passed. Chen still works the night shift in Lamar Valley, but he's developed protocols for responding to similar reports that prioritize immediate evacuation over investigation. He's learned that some mysteries are better left unsolved, especially when the cost of understanding comes at the expense of human psychological well-being. The circular paths still appear around remote campsites, and Chen still documents them. But he no longer seeks to understand what creates them or why they exist. Let's move to our third story, one that has haunted park rangers across multiple states for decades and continues to defy every attempt at logical explanation. Ranger Patricia Williams had heard whispers about the staircases during her training at Olympic National Park, but like most new rangers, she dismissed them as folklore, campfire stories designed to spook rookies during their first assignments in the deep wilderness. Williams had been stationed in the Hoh Rainforest section of Olympic for 6 months when she encountered her first staircase in March 2018. She was conducting a routine boundary survey, marking GPS coordinates for a new trail maintenance project, when she stumbled upon something that shouldn't exist in the middle of pristine wilderness. Rising from the forest floor, surrounded by ancient Douglas firs and western hemlocks, stood a perfectly preserved wooden staircase. The structure was remarkable in its ordinariness. Constructed from what appeared to be standard residential lumber, the staircase featured a simple handrail and 12 steps leading upward to nothing. There was no house, no building foundation, no structure of any kind that would explain its presence. The staircase simply existed, as if someone had carefully extracted it from a suburban home and placed it randomly in the forest. What made the discovery even more unsettling was the staircase's condition. Despite being exposed to the Pacific Northwest's notorious rainfall and humidity, the wood showed no signs of rot, weathering, or insect damage. The lumber appeared freshly cut and recently installed, with sharp edges and clean joints that suggested recent construction. Yet the forest around it had clearly grown undisturbed for decades, with massive trees and established undergrowth that would have taken years to develop. Williams documented the staircase's location and dimensions, photographing it from multiple angles while trying to develop a rational explanation for its presence. Her initial theory involved illegal dumping or abandoned construction projects. But the staircase's perfect condition and the surrounding forest's undisturbed state made these explanations increasingly unlikely. The ranger's investigation revealed that the staircase was anchored to nothing. The bottom step rested directly on the forest floor with no foundation or support structure. Yet the entire assembly remained perfectly stable and level. When Williams tested the structure by climbing the first few steps, she found it solid and secure, capable of supporting her full weight without any movement or creaking. More disturbing was what Williams discovered when she researched similar incidents. Her supervisor, Ranger Captain James Rodriguez, reluctantly confirmed that staircases had been reported throughout Olympic National Park for over 20 years. Each report described the same basic phenomenon: well-constructed wooden staircases appearing in remote wilderness areas, with no logical explanation for their presence. Rodriguez shared files documenting 17 separate staircase discoveries across the park system, each one photographed and GPS located, but never removed or explained. The staircases varied in design and materials, from simple wooden steps to elaborate constructions with ornate railings and decorative elements. What they shared was their inexplicable presence in locations where no human construction should exist. The most unsettling aspect of Rodriguez's files was the pattern of ranger behavior surrounding the staircases. Multiple rangers had reported an overwhelming compulsion to climb the structures, describing an almost hypnotic attraction that grew stronger the longer they remained in proximity to the stairs. Several rangers had climbed part-way up before experiencing sudden, inexplicable terror that forced them to retreat. Williams learned about Ranger Mark Thompson, who had discovered a staircase in the Quinault area in 2015. Thompson had climbed to the 8th step of a 12-step structure when he reported experiencing what he described as absolute wrongness. According to his incident report, Thompson felt as if he was ascending into something that violated fundamental laws of reality, a space where normal physics and logic no longer applied. Thompson's description of his experience became increasingly incoherent as he attempted to explain what he'd encountered on those upper steps. He wrote about feeling disconnected from his own body, experiencing time distortion, and sensing the presence of something vast and malevolent watching him from above. The ranger had fled the scene and requested immediate transfer to a different park, never returning to the area where he'd found the staircase. Even more disturbing were the accounts of rangers who had climbed to the top of the staircases. Williams found 3 documented cases of rangers who had ascended complete staircase structures, and all 3 had required psychological evaluation and extended leave following their experiences. Their reports, heavily redacted in the official files, described encounters with phenomena that challenged their understanding of reality itself. Ranger Susan Martinez had climbed a 15-step staircase in the Sol Duc area in 2016. Her report, written weeks after the incident, described reaching the top step and finding herself in what she called a place between places. Martinez wrote about experiencing multiple realities simultaneously, seeing the forest from perspectives that should have been impossible, and encountering entities that existed in forms her mind couldn't properly process. The psychological evaluation following Martinez's experience noted severe trauma symptoms consistent with exposure to extreme stress. But the evaluating psychologist couldn't identify any conventional cause for her condition. Martinez eventually returned to duty, but requested assignment to visitor centers and developed an intense aversion to wilderness areas that persisted throughout the remainder of her career. Williams discovered that the staircase phenomenon wasn't limited to Olympic National Park. Her research revealed similar reports from rangers across the country, spanning decades and involving every major wilderness area in the United States. The consistency of the reports across different geographic regions and time periods suggested a phenomenon that was both widespread and persistent. The National Park Service's official position on the staircases remained deliberately vague. Internal memos Williams obtained through informal channels indicated that the service was aware of the phenomenon, but had chosen not to investigate it systematically. The reasoning, according to these documents, was that the staircases posed no immediate threat to public safety, and that investigation might draw unwanted attention to areas better left undisturbed. Williams made the decision to climb her discovered staircase 3 weeks after her initial encounter. Despite warnings from colleagues and her own growing sense of unease, she felt compelled to understand what the other rangers had experienced. She prepared carefully, bringing communication equipment and arranging for regular check-ins with the ranger station. The ascent began normally enough. The first few steps felt solid and ordinary, no different from climbing stairs in any building. Williams noted the craftsmanship of the construction, observing details like perfectly aligned joints and smooth handrail surfaces that suggested professional carpentry work. The wood felt warm under her hands, despite the cool forest air. By the 6th step, Williams began experiencing the disorientation other rangers had described. The forest around her seemed to shift and blur, as if she was viewing it through water or thick glass. Sounds became muffled and distorted, with familiar forest noises taking on alien qualities that made her skin crawl. The sensation of climbing became disconnected from physical reality, as if she was ascending through space rather than up a physical structure. Williams reached the 10th step before the terror hit her with overwhelming force. She described the experience as encountering something fundamentally incompatible with human consciousness, a presence or reality that her mind couldn't process without risking permanent damage. The fear wasn't rational or explainable, but absolute and primal, triggering every survival instinct she possessed. The ranger fled down the staircase and didn't stop running until she reached her vehicle nearly a mile away. Her hands shook for hours afterward, and she found herself unable to articulate what she'd experienced on those upper steps. The incident report she filed was deliberately vague, focusing on the staircase's physical characteristics rather than her psychological experience during the climb. Williams never returned to the staircase's location, despite her professional obligations to monitor the area. She arranged for other rangers to handle surveys and maintenance in that section of the forest, citing scheduling conflicts and equipment issues. The staircase remains documented in park files, but no ranger has attempted to climb it since Williams' experience. The phenomenon continues to this day, with new staircases appearing regularly in wilderness areas across the country. Park services have developed informal protocols for dealing with discoveries, emphasizing documentation over investigation and strongly discouraging rangers from climbing the structures. The official stance remains that the staircases are unexplained but harmless, though internal communications suggest a much deeper concern about their true nature and purpose. Williams eventually transferred to a desk position at park headquarters, citing a desire for new challenges. But colleagues noted her changed demeanor and persistent nervousness around wilderness areas. She continues to research the staircase phenomenon privately, compiling reports and testimonies from rangers across the country, but has never publicly discussed her own experience or the conclusions her research has led her to reach. The staircases remain, standing silent and inexplicable in forests across America, waiting for the next curious ranger or hiker to test their resolve against the unknown. Those who know about them speak in whispers, sharing warnings disguised as casual advice. If you find stairs in the woods, document them, report them, but never, under any circumstances, climb them. Some mysteries are better left unsolved, and some heights are never meant to be reached. The search for Sarah Mitchell began on a Tuesday morning in October 2020, when her failure to return from a solo hiking trip triggered one of the most disturbing search and rescue operations in Great Smoky Mountains National Park history. Ranger Captain Lisa Rodriguez had coordinated dozens of missing person searches during her 15-year career. But the Mitchell case would challenge everything she thought she knew about wilderness disappearances and leave her questioning the very nature of what lurked in the ancient Appalachian forests. Sarah Mitchell was a 28-year-old graduate student from Knoxville, an experienced hiker who had explored the Smokies extensively over the past 5 years. She'd left detailed trail plans with Park Services, indicating her intention to hike the remote Bone Valley Trail, a challenging 12-mile loop that attracted serious hikers seeking solitude in the park's most pristine wilderness areas. When Sarah failed to return by her scheduled check-in time, her roommate contacted park authorities, initiating a search protocol that would soon reveal something far more sinister than a typical hiking accident. Rodriguez assembled a search team at dawn on Wednesday, organizing experienced rangers and volunteer searchers into systematic grid patterns designed to cover the Bone Valley area comprehensively. The weather had been clear for the past week, with no storms or unusual conditions that might explain a hiker becoming lost or injured. Sarah's experience level and meticulous planning made a simple navigation error unlikely. But Rodriguez had seen enough wilderness emergencies to know that even experienced outdoors people could fall victim to unexpected circumstances. The first sign that something was wrong came when the search team located Sarah's abandoned backpack approximately 4 miles into the Bone Valley Trail. The pack was found sitting upright beside the trail, positioned as if Sarah had simply set it down for a rest break. Nothing appeared to be missing from the pack's contents, including valuable items like her camera, GPS device, and emergency supplies that would typically be taken by someone in distress. What disturbed Rodriguez most about the backpack's discovery was its pristine condition. Despite being exposed to the elements for at least 2 days, the pack showed no signs of weather damage, animal interference, or the kind of wear that would be expected from being abandoned in the wilderness. The zippers were closed, the straps were neatly arranged, and the entire pack appeared to have been placed deliberately rather than dropped in panic or haste. The search team's tracking specialist, Ranger Tom Bradley, discovered the first blood evidence approximately 50 yards from the backpack location. A small cluster of dark stains on fallen leaves marked the beginning of what would become the most unsettling trail Bradley had followed in 20 years of search and rescue work. The blood pattern was unlike anything he'd encountered in previous cases involving injured hikers or animal attacks, rather than the random splatter or drag marks typically associated with wilderness injuries. The blood formed a deliberate pattern leading deeper into the forest. The drops were evenly spaced, roughly 18 inches apart, creating a trail that was almost geometrically precise in its consistency. Bradley noted that the blood appeared fresh, despite being exposed for multiple days, maintaining a bright red color that should have darkened and coagulated under normal circumstances. Following the blood trail led the search team away from established hiking paths and into increasingly dense forest terrain. The spacing and volume of the blood drops remained unnaturally consistent, never varying despite changes in elevation, vegetation density, or ground conditions. Bradley observed that the trails seemed to navigate around obstacles with an intelligence that suggested deliberate planning, rather than the erratic movement of an injured person seeking help. After following the blood trail for nearly 2 miles, The search team made a discovery that fundamentally changed the nature of their investigation. Sarah's hiking boots were found placed side by side on a fallen log, positioned with military precision and showing no signs of having been removed in distress. The boots were clean, dry, and appeared to have been carefully arranged rather than abandoned. What made the boot discovery even more disturbing was the continuation of the blood trail beyond their location. The drops continued with the same precise spacing and consistency, but now they were accompanied by what appeared to be bare footprints in the soft earth. The prints were human in basic shape, but showed anatomical irregularities that Bradley couldn't explain through conventional tracking knowledge. The footprints were larger than would be expected for Sarah's petite frame, with elongated toes and an unusual gait pattern that suggested movement unlike normal human locomotion. The depth and clarity of the prints indicated someone or something moving with purpose and confidence through terrain that would challenge even experienced hikers. Most unsettling was the complete absence of any signs of struggle or distress in the surrounding area. Rodriguez made the decision to continue following the trail despite growing concerns about the safety of her search team. The blood drops and footprints led them deeper into a section of the park that rarely saw human visitors. An area of old-growth forest where massive trees created a canopy so dense that little sunlight reached the forest floor. The atmosphere in this section of wilderness felt different, charged with an energy that made several team members visibly uncomfortable. The trail led to a clearing that appeared to be artificially created, a perfect circle of bare earth surrounded by towering trees. The blood drops formed a spiral pattern within the clearing, leading to the center where the search team made their most disturbing discovery. Sarah's clothing was arranged in a neat pile, each item folded with care and precision that suggested ritual rather than random abandonment. The clothing showed no signs of damage, tearing, or struggle. Each piece appeared to have been removed carefully and folded with a kind of attention to detail that was completely inconsistent with an emergency situation or violent encounter. The arrangement of the items suggested ceremony or purpose, as if Sarah's disappearance was part of some larger, incomprehensible plan. Bradley's examination of the clearing revealed additional disturbing details. The bare earth showed signs of repeated use, with packed soil and worn patterns that indicated this location had been visited multiple times over an extended period. Strange symbols were carved into several of the surrounding trees, markings that appeared ancient but showed no signs of weathering or age. The blood trail ended abruptly at the center of the clearing, with no indication of where it might continue or what had happened to Sarah. The search team expanded their investigation to cover a 5-mile radius around the clearing, but found no additional evidence of Sarah's presence or fate. It was as if she had simply vanished from the center of that mysterious circle, leaving behind only her possessions and the disturbing evidence of her final journey. Rodriguez contacted federal authorities and expanded the search to include specialized tracking teams and forensic specialists. The blood samples were analyzed and confirmed to be human, matching Sarah's blood type. But DNA analysis revealed anomalies that the laboratory couldn't explain. The blood showed cellular structures that were consistent with human physiology, but contained elements that didn't match any known biological markers. The footprint analysis proved equally puzzling. Forensic specialists confirmed that the prints were made by bare human feet, but the anatomical measurements didn't correspond to any known human foot structure. The elongated proportions and unusual pressure patterns suggested either severe deformity or something that wasn't entirely human, making the prints. Weeks of intensive searching failed to locate any trace of Sarah Mitchell beyond the evidence found in the mysterious clearing. The case officially remained open, classified as a missing person investigation, But Rodriguez knew that conventional search methods had been exhausted. Whatever had happened to Sarah in that remote section of the Smokies defied normal explanation and challenged every assumption about wilderness safety and human disappearances. The psychological impact on the search team was significant and lasting. Several volunteers requested to be removed from future search operations, citing nightmares and anxiety attacks triggered by their experience in the clearing. Bradley, despite his extensive experience with wilderness tracking, developed an aversion to solo operations and requested assignment to areas with higher visitor traffic. Rodriguez continued investigating similar cases, discovering a pattern of disappearances in remote wilderness areas across the Appalachian region. The common elements were disturbing in their consistency. Experienced hikers vanishing without trace, personal belongings arranged with unnatural precision, and blood trails that led to locations where normal tracking methods failed to provide answers. The Sarah Mitchell case remains one of the most thoroughly documented, unexplained disappearances in National Park Service history. The evidence collected from the clearing is stored in federal facilities, but no official explanation has ever been provided for the anomalous blood analysis or the impossible footprint patterns. The case file continues to grow as similar incidents are reported across the country, suggesting a phenomenon that extends far beyond a single missing person case. Rodriguez eventually transferred to administrative duties, citing the emotional toll of unsolved cases. But she continues to research disappearances in wilderness areas. Her private files contain dozens of similar cases, each one adding to a pattern that suggests something systematic and purposeful operating in America's most remote forests. The truth about what happened to Sarah Mitchell may never be known. But her case serves as a stark reminder that some mysteries in the wilderness are darker and more complex than simple accidents or animal encounters. The Bone Valley Trail remains open to hikers, but Park Services have installed additional warning signs and required detailed itineraries for anyone planning to explore the more remote sections. The clearing where Sarah's belongings were found is not marked on any official maps, but rangers know its location and monitor it regularly for any signs of renewed activity. Some places in the wilderness hold secrets that are better left undisturbed, and some trails lead to destinations that no human should ever reach. Ranger Michael Santos had been patrolling the remote sections of Sequoia National Park for 8 years when he made the discovery that would haunt him for the rest of his career. It was a routine morning patrol in November 2021, the kind of crisp autumn day when the forest felt alive with possibility and the air carried the promise of winter's approach. Santos was checking trail conditions along the lesser-used Morro Rock backcountry routes, documenting fallen trees and erosion damage for the upcoming maintenance season. The discovery came at mile marker 7 of the Crescent Meadow Trail, in a section of old-growth forest where massive sequoias created natural cathedrals of shadow and filtered sunlight. Santos was photographing a damaged trail sign when something caught his eye on a nearby tree trunk, something that didn't belong in the pristine wilderness setting. What he initially mistook for an unusual fungal growth or piece of debris revealed itself to be something far more disturbing upon closer inspection. Nailed to the bark of an ancient sequoia, approximately 6 feet from the ground, was a human thumb. The appendage was secured to the tree with a single railroad spike driven through the base, pinning it against the reddish bark with deliberate precision. The thumb appeared fresh, showing no signs of decomposition despite being exposed to the elements. And the nail bed still retained traces of what appeared to be purple nail polish. Santos had encountered his share of disturbing scenes during his tenure as a park ranger, from fatal accidents to animal attacks. But nothing had prepared him for the calculated horror of this discovery. The thumb wasn't simply discarded or accidentally lost. It had been deliberately placed and secured with tools that suggested premeditation and purpose. The railroad spike was driven deep into the tree's bark, requiring significant force and the right equipment to achieve such penetration. What made the discovery even more unsettling was the precision of the placement. The thumb was positioned at exactly eye level for an average-height adult, suggesting that whoever had placed it wanted it to be found and noticed. The nail had been driven through the base of the thumb at the joint, securing it firmly while leaving the rest of the digit clearly visible and identifiable as human remains. Santos immediately secured the scene and contacted park headquarters, initiating protocols for potential criminal activity within park boundaries. The response team included federal investigators, forensic specialists, and additional rangers trained in evidence collection. The remote location and lack of vehicle access meant that all personnel and equipment had to be transported on foot, creating logistical challenges that delayed the full investigation by several hours. The forensic examination revealed details that deepened the mystery rather than providing answers. The thumb belonged to a female, estimated to be between 20 and 40 years old, based on bone structure and tissue analysis. The nail polish was identified as a common drugstore brand, available nationwide, providing no useful leads for identification. Most disturbing was the condition of the severed digit, which showed signs of having been removed with surgical precision rather than torn or cut in a struggle. The railroad spike used to secure the thumb was traced to a batch manufactured in the 1940s, the type commonly used in railroad construction throughout the western United States. However, the spike showed no signs of age or weathering despite being decades old, appearing as if it had been recently cleaned and prepared specifically for this purpose. The deliberate selection of an antique spike suggested someone with specific knowledge or access to historical railroad materials. Investigation of the surrounding area revealed no additional evidence of human presence or activity. The forest floor showed no footprints, disturbed vegetation, or other signs that someone had recently visited the location. The absence of any trail leading to or from the tree made the placement of the thumb seem almost supernatural, as if it had appeared without any human intervention. The tree itself became a focus of the investigation when forensic specialists discovered that the bark around the spike showed signs of previous damage. Careful examination revealed multiple old puncture wounds in the same area, suggesting that this tree had been used for similar purposes before. The pattern of old wounds formed a rough circle around the fresh spike, indicating systematic use of this location over an extended period. Santos learned that similar discoveries had been made in other national parks across the western United States, always involving human body parts secured to trees with antique railroad spikes. The pattern suggested a serial perpetrator or group operating across multiple states, using national parks as locations for their disturbing activities. Each incident shared the same characteristics: surgical precision in the amputation, antique railroad spikes, and complete absence of evidence regarding how the remains were transported to remote locations. The investigation expanded to include missing person reports from across the region, but no matches were found for the thumb's owner. DNA analysis failed to identify the victim, and dental records couldn't be obtained from a single digit. The lack of identification meant that the owner of the thumb remained anonymous, adding another layer of tragedy to the already disturbing discovery. Federal investigators theorized that the thumb might be connected to organized criminal activity, possibly involving human trafficking or ritualistic violence. The surgical precision of the amputation suggested medical knowledge or experience. while the use of antique railroad spikes indicated someone with access to historical materials or specialized collections. The remote locations chosen for these displays suggested intimate knowledge of national park systems and backcountry areas. Santos found himself assigned to monitor the tree location as part of ongoing surveillance efforts. Regular patrols were established to watch for any additional activity or evidence that might lead to the perpetrator's identification. The psychological impact of repeatedly visiting the site where he'd made such a disturbing discovery began to affect Santos's mental health and job performance. The ranger developed an obsession with understanding the purpose behind the thumb's placement. He spent hours researching historical uses of railroad spikes, ritualistic practices involving human remains, and criminal cases with similar characteristics. His research led him into increasingly dark corners of human behavior, exposing him to information that further damaged his psychological well-being. Months passed without any additional discoveries or leads in the case. The thumb was eventually removed from the tree and stored as evidence, but the spike remained embedded in the bark as a permanent reminder of the incident. Santos noticed that wildlife began avoiding the area around the tree, with birds refusing to nest in its branches and small mammals creating detours around its base. The psychological impact on Santos intensified when he discovered additional spikes embedded in trees throughout his patrol area. A systematic search revealed 17 other locations where antique railroad spikes had been driven into sequoia bark, though none of these contained human remains. The pattern suggested that the thumb discovery was part of a larger, ongoing activity that extended far beyond a single incident. Santos began experiencing nightmares and anxiety attacks related to his patrol duties. The sight of railroad spikes in any context triggered intense emotional responses, and he found himself unable to perform routine maintenance tasks that involved metal tools or hardware. His supervisor recommended psychological counseling, but Santos was reluctant to discuss the details of his experience with mental health professionals. The case officially remains open, classified as an ongoing federal investigation into criminal activity within national park boundaries. The thumb has been preserved as evidence, but no additional body parts have been discovered despite continued surveillance of the area. The lack of progress in identifying either the victim or the perpetrator has led to reduced investigative resources being allocated to the case. Santos eventually requested transfer to administrative duties, citing health concerns that prevented him from continuing fieldwork. His replacement was briefed on the thumb discovery and the ongoing investigation, but was not told about the psychological impact the case had on Santos or the pattern of similar incidents across other parks. The tree where the thumb was discovered continues to be monitored, but no additional evidence has been found. The embedded railroad spikes remain as silent witnesses to activities that no one fully understands. Park visitors occasionally ask about the metal objects protruding from various trees, but rangers are instructed to describe them as historical artifacts rather than evidence in an ongoing criminal investigation. Santos now works in park administration, processing permits and managing visitor services, but he continues to research similar cases in his spare time. His files contain dozens of reports from other parks involving human remains and antique railroad spikes, suggesting a phenomenon that extends far beyond his single discovery. The truth about who placed that thumb on the tree and why remains as mysterious as the day Santos first encountered it during his routine patrol. The case serves as a reminder that national parks, despite their reputation as places of natural beauty and peace, can harbor secrets as dark as any urban crime scene. The wilderness may seem pristine and untouched, but it can also provide perfect cover for activities that civilized society prefers not to acknowledge or understand. Ranger Elena Vasquez had been working the graveyard shift at Glacier National Park for 4 years when she received the call that would forever change her understanding of what lurked in the Montana wilderness. It was a bitter February night in 2022. With temperatures plunging to -20 degrees and snow falling steadily across the park's remote backcountry areas. Most visitors had long since departed for warmer climates, leaving the vast wilderness to the handful of rangers who maintained essential services during the harsh winter months. The call came through on her radio at 2:47 a.m., crackling with static but unmistakably human voices calling for help. Multiple voices, overlapping and desperate, seemed to be transmitting from somewhere deep in the park's interior. Vasquez had handled countless emergency calls during her tenure, but something about these voices immediately set her on edge. They carried a quality of desperation that went beyond typical hiking accidents or weather-related emergencies. "Help us. Please help us," came the primary voice, a woman who sounded middle-aged and terrified. "We're lost and someone is hurt badly. We can see lights, but we can't reach them. Please, we've been walking for hours and we're so cold." The transmission was interrupted by what sounded like sobbing and the voices of at least 2 other people, including what appeared to be a child crying in the background. Vasquez immediately attempted to establish 2-way communication, following standard emergency protocols for lost hikers. "This is Ranger Vasquez at Glacier National Park. I'm receiving your transmission. Can you tell me your location or describe any landmarks you can see?" Her response was met with silence, followed by another burst of the same desperate pleas for help, as if her transmission hadn't been received. The voices continued their distress calls, providing fragmentary details about their situation that painted a picture of a family group lost in severe weather conditions. They mentioned seeing lights in the distance that they couldn't reach, described being separated from their vehicle, and spoke of someone in their group who had suffered what sounded like a serious injury. The emotional intensity of their pleas was heartbreaking, driving Vasquez to immediate action despite the dangerous weather conditions. Following park protocols for winter emergency response, Vasquez contacted her supervisor and initiated search and rescue procedures. The challenge was determining the location of the distressed hikers based solely on radio transmissions that provided no clear geographical references. The voices mentioned seeing lights, which could indicate proximity to the park's few winter-accessible facilities. But the vast wilderness area made pinpointing their location extremely difficult. Vasquez began her search by checking the park's few accessible winter camping areas and emergency shelters. The voices continued transmitting sporadically, always with the same desperate tone and similar pleas for help. What began to disturb Vasquez was the repetitive nature of the transmissions. The same phrases were repeated with identical inflection and timing, as if she was hearing recordings rather than live communications. As she drove through the snow-covered park roads, following the strongest radio signals, Vasquez noticed that the voices seemed to be leading her deeper into increasingly remote and dangerous terrain. The transmissions grew stronger as she moved away from established roads and facilities, drawing her toward areas that would be nearly impossible to access during winter conditions without specialized equipment. The voices led her to the Going to the Sun Road, which was closed to vehicle traffic during winter months due to extreme avalanche danger and impassable snow conditions. The radio signals were strongest at the road closure barriers, suggesting that the distressed hikers were somewhere beyond the accessible areas. Vasquez faced a critical decision: attempt a dangerous winter rescue in avalanche-prone terrain, or wait for daylight and additional resources. The desperation in the voices made waiting seem unconscionable. The woman's pleas had become increasingly frantic, describing worsening conditions and the deteriorating state of the injured person in their group. Against her better judgment and park safety protocols, Vasquez decided to proceed on foot beyond the road closure, following the radio signals deeper into the wilderness. The trek through deep snow and sub-zero temperatures was exhausting and dangerous. Vasquez used snowshoes and followed avalanche safety procedures. But she was essentially conducting a solo rescue operation in conditions that would challenge even experienced mountaineers. The voices continued to guide her forward, always seeming to originate from just ahead, just beyond the next ridge or around the next bend. After hiking for over 2 hours in brutal conditions, Vasquez made a discovery that fundamentally changed her understanding of the situation. She recognized one of the voices calling for help. It was her own voice, pleading desperately for rescue from somewhere in the darkness ahead. The realization hit her like a physical blow, causing her to stop dead in her tracks as the implications sank in. The voice she was hearing was unmistakably her own, but speaking words she had never said, describing a situation she was not experiencing. Her own voice was calling for help from a location she had never been, speaking with an emotional intensity that perfectly matched the other distressed voices she'd been following. The psychological impact of hearing herself beg for rescue was overwhelming and disorienting. Vasquez attempted to rationalize the experience, considering equipment malfunctions or atmospheric phenomena that might explain hearing her own voice on the radio. But the voice was too clear, too perfectly matched to her own speech patterns and vocal characteristics to be explained by technical glitches or radio interference. She was hearing herself calling for help from somewhere in the wilderness ahead. The other voices continued their pleas, but now Vasquez began to recognize them as well. The woman who had first called for help sounded exactly like her supervisor, Ranger Captain Sarah Morrison. The child's voice belonged to her nephew, who lived hundreds of miles away and had never visited the park. One by one, she identified the voices as people she knew, all calling desperately for rescue from a situation they were not actually experiencing. The realization that she was following phantom voices deeper into dangerous wilderness forced Vasquez to make the difficult decision to abandon the rescue attempt. The voices were not coming from real people in distress, but from some unknown source that was using familiar voices to lure her into increasingly perilous terrain. The psychological manipulation was sophisticated and terrifying, suggesting intelligence behind the phenomenon. Vasquez began her retreat toward safety, but the voices followed her, becoming more desperate and accusatory as she moved away from their source. Her own voice began pleading specifically with her, using her name and personal details that no one else should know. "Elena, please don't leave us. You know you can save us. Why are you abandoning us when we need you most?" The emotional manipulation was expertly crafted to exploit her sense of duty and compassion. The trek back to her vehicle became a psychological nightmare as the voices continued their assault on her resolve. They spoke of freezing to death, of the injured person dying because of her abandonment, of children crying for help that would never come. The voices knew exactly which emotional triggers would be most effective, suggesting access to information about her personality and psychological makeup that should have been impossible. Vasquez reached her vehicle as dawn was breaking, exhausted both physically and emotionally from the night's ordeal. The voices had finally faded as she moved away from the remote wilderness area, but their impact on her psychological state was profound and lasting. She filed a report describing equipment malfunction and atmospheric interference, unable to document the true nature of her experience without risking her career and credibility. Investigation of the incident revealed no evidence of actual hikers in distress anywhere in the park. No missing person reports matched the voices Vasquez had heard, and no emergency beacons or distress signals had been activated. The radio equipment showed no signs of malfunction, and atmospheric conditions were not conducive to the kind of interference that might explain the phantom transmissions. Vasquez continued working at Glacier National Park, but she never again responded to emergency calls alone during night shifts. She developed protocols for verifying the authenticity of distress calls and insisted on backup for all wilderness rescue operations. Her colleagues noticed her changed demeanor and increased caution, but she never fully explained the reasons for her new approach to emergency response. The psychological impact of the experience persisted for months after the incident. Vasquez found herself questioning the authenticity of routine radio communications and developed an aversion to solo operations in remote areas. She began experiencing nightmares featuring the voices of people she knew calling for help from situations where she was powerless to assist them. Research into similar incidents revealed a pattern of phantom distress calls reported by rangers and emergency responders across multiple national parks. The common elements were disturbing in their consistency. Voices of known individuals calling for help from impossible situations, transmissions that led responders into increasingly dangerous terrain, and complete absence of actual people in distress. Vasquez eventually transferred to daytime visitor services, citing personal reasons for avoiding night shift duties. She continues to work in the park system, but has never returned to the remote areas where she encountered the phantom voices. Her experience serves as a cautionary tale about the psychological dangers that can lurk in the wilderness. Threats that target the very compassion and dedication that drive people to become park rangers. The voices still transmit occasionally from the remote areas of Glacier National Park, always during the darkest hours of winter nights when conditions are most dangerous for rescue operations. Current protocols require verification of all distress calls through multiple channels before initiating response. But the voices continue to call, waiting for the next compassionate ranger who might be willing to risk everything to save people who may not actually exist. Search and rescue coordinator Jake Morrison had led over 200 wilderness recovery operations during his 12-year career with the Colorado State Park Service. But nothing had prepared him for what his team would discover in the remote backcountry of Rocky Mountain National Park in August 2020. The search began as a routine missing hiker case, but it would evolve into one of the most disturbing and inexplicable incidents in the park's recorded history. The missing hiker was Dr. Amanda Chen, a botany professor from Colorado State University who had been conducting research on high-altitude plant communities in the park's most remote wilderness areas. Chen was an experienced mountaineer and researcher who had spent countless hours in the Colorado backcountry, making her disappearance particularly concerning to park authorities. She had been expected to return from a 3-day solo research expedition, but when she failed to check in at the scheduled time, her department contacted Park Services. Morrison assembled a specialized search team consisting of experienced wilderness trackers, technical rescue specialists, and search dogs trained in high-altitude operations. Chen's research permits provided detailed information about her planned route through the Mummy Range, a remote section of the park known for its challenging terrain and unpredictable weather conditions. The search began at her last known location, a research site where she had been collecting plant specimens near timberline. The initial search efforts followed standard protocols, with teams systematically covering Chen's planned route and expanding outward from her last confirmed position. The terrain was challenging, consisting of steep rocky slopes, dense forest, and alpine meadows that required technical climbing skills to navigate safely. Weather conditions were favorable, with clear skies and mild temperatures that should have made the search relatively straightforward. On the second day of the search operation, Morrison's team made their first unusual discovery. Approximately 3 miles from Chen's last known position, they encountered a clearing that appeared to be artificially created in the middle of dense forest. The clearing was perfectly circular, measuring exactly 60 feet in diameter, with boundaries so precise they appeared to have been drawn with surveying equipment. What made the clearing immediately unsettling was the complete absence of vegetation within its boundaries. The forest floor, which should have been covered with the typical undergrowth of ferns, wildflowers, and small shrubs found throughout the region, was completely bare. The soil appeared healthy and fertile, but nothing grew within the circle's boundaries, creating a stark contrast with the lush forest that surrounded it. Morrison had encountered natural clearings before, areas where avalanches, fires, or disease had created open spaces in the forest canopy. But this clearing showed none of the characteristics of natural forest disturbance. There were no fallen trees, no signs of fire damage, no evidence of disease or insect infestation that might explain the absence of vegetation. The clearing appeared to have been deliberately created and maintained by some unknown force. The search team's botanist, Dr. Sarah Williams, conducted soil samples and vegetation analysis around the clearing's perimeter. Her findings were deeply disturbing and scientifically inexplicable. The soil within the clearing was chemically identical to the surrounding forest floor, with the same pH levels, nutrient content, and organic composition that should have supported abundant plant growth. Yet nothing would grow within the circle's boundaries. Even more unsettling was Williams's discovery that the clearing's edge was marked by an invisible barrier that plants would not cross. Vegetation grew right up to the circle's perimeter, then stopped abruptly as if encountering an impenetrable wall. Root systems from surrounding trees and shrubs approached the clearing's edge, but never penetrated into the circular area, creating a botanical phenomenon that defied known principles of plant biology. The search team's attention was drawn to the center of the clearing, where they made a discovery that transformed their missing person search into something far more sinister. Arranged in a perfect spiral pattern at the clearing's center was a collection of personal belongings that appeared to span decades of time. Backpacks, hiking boots, camping equipment, and personal items were arranged with mathematical precision, creating a display that was both organized and deeply disturbing. Morrison's examination of the items revealed that they belonged to multiple individuals who had disappeared in the Colorado wilderness over the past 30 years. Driver's licenses, credit cards, and personal identification found among the belongings matched missing person reports dating back to the early 1990s. The items showed no signs of weathering or deterioration, despite being exposed to mountain weather conditions for decades. The most disturbing aspect of the discovery was the deliberate arrangement of the belongings. Each item had been carefully placed according to some unknown organizational system, with similar objects grouped together and personal effects arranged in patterns that suggested ritual or ceremony. The precision of the arrangement indicated intelligence and purpose behind the collection, transforming what should have been random debris into something that resembled an altar or memorial. Among the collected items, Morrison found Dr. Chen's research notebook and GPS device, confirming that she had reached this location during her expedition. Her equipment was placed at the outer edge of the spiral arrangement, suggesting that her disappearance was the most recent addition to a collection that had been growing for decades. The notebook's final entries described her discovery of the clearing and her fascination with its unusual botanical properties. Chen's notes revealed that she had spent considerable time studying the clearing's vegetation patterns and had collected extensive soil samples for laboratory analysis. Her scientific observations documented the same phenomena that Williams had discovered. But Chen's notes also included increasingly disturbed commentary about the clearing's effect on her psychological state. Her final entries described feeling watched and experiencing an overwhelming compulsion to remain in the clearing despite her planned departure schedule. The search team expanded their investigation to include the area surrounding the clearing, but found no additional evidence of Chen's presence or fate. The forest beyond the circle showed no signs of human passage. No footprints or disturbed vegetation that might indicate where Chen had gone after reaching the clearing. It was as if she had simply vanished from the center of the circle, leaving behind only her research materials and personal effects. Morrison contacted federal authorities and expanded the search to include specialized forensic teams and missing person investigators. The discovery of belongings from multiple decades of disappearances elevated the case from a single missing person incident to a potential serial crime investigation. The remote location and lack of vehicle access complicated the investigation, requiring all personnel and equipment to be transported by helicopter. The forensic examination of the clearing revealed additional disturbing details that deepened the mystery rather than providing answers. Ground-penetrating radar detected no buried remains or hidden structures beneath the clearing's surface. The soil showed no signs of disturbance or excavation, despite the decades of accumulated personal belongings found at its center. The absence of any physical evidence of violence or disposal methods made the disappearances even more inexplicable. Wildlife biologists brought in to study the clearing's ecosystem discovered that animals avoided the area completely. Trail cameras placed around the perimeter documented normal wildlife activity in the surrounding forest. But no animals were ever recorded entering the circular clearing. Even insects and birds avoided the space, creating a zone of complete biological silence that extended beyond the vegetation barrier. The psychological impact on the search team became evident as the investigation continued. Several team members reported experiencing disorientation and anxiety while working within the clearing's boundaries. The complete silence and absence of normal forest sounds created an oppressive atmosphere that affected everyone who spent extended time in the area. Morrison noticed that team members became increasingly reluctant to work alone within the circle. Dr. Williams' continued botanical research revealed that the clearing's vegetation barrier was not static, but appeared to be slowly expanding. Measurements taken over several weeks showed that the circle's diameter was increasing at a rate of approximately 1 inch per month. The implications of this expansion were deeply troubling, suggesting that whatever force maintained the clearing was growing stronger over time. The investigation eventually concluded without finding any trace of Dr. Chen or providing explanations for the decades of disappearances connected to the clearing. The personal belongings were cataloged as evidence, but no forensic analysis could determine what had happened to their owners. The clearing was designated as a restricted area, closed to public access pending further investigation. Morrison continued working search and rescue operations, but he never returned to the clearing after the initial investigation. The psychological impact of the discovery affected his approach to wilderness searches, making him more cautious about investigating unusual geographical features or unexplained phenomena. He developed protocols for documenting and avoiding areas that showed signs of unnatural characteristics. The clearing remains under federal investigation, monitored by remote cameras and periodic scientific surveys. The vegetation barrier continues to expand slowly, and the spiral arrangement of personal belongings remains undisturbed at its center. No additional disappearances have been definitively linked to the location. But the area continues to be avoided by wildlife and experienced outdoors people who sense something fundamentally wrong about the perfect circle of silence. Dr. Chen's fate remains unknown, adding her name to the decades-long list of people who vanished after encountering the clearing. Her research materials continue to be studied by scientists, attempting to understand the botanical and geological anomalies associated with the site. But no conventional explanations have been found for the phenomena observed there. The case serves as a reminder that some places in the wilderness exist outside the normal rules of nature and human understanding. The perfect clearing continues to grow, slowly expanding its zone of silence and collecting the belongings of those who venture too close to its mysterious center. Some discoveries in the wilderness are better left unexplored, and some clearings are meant to remain empty of human presence. Ranger Thomas Kellerman had been patrolling the remote sections of Denali National Park for 6 years when he encountered something that would shatter his understanding of identity and reality forever. It was a cold September morning in 2019, with the Alaskan wilderness displaying its autumn colors in brilliant reds and golds across the vast tundra landscape. Kellerman was conducting a routine wildlife survey along the Savage River area, documenting animal populations and checking trail conditions before the harsh winter months made the backcountry inaccessible. The morning had been unremarkable, filled with the typical duties of a wilderness ranger in one of America's most remote national parks. Kellerman had been tracking a small herd of caribou, photographing their movements and noting their general health condition for the park's annual wildlife report. The work was solitary but rewarding, offering him the kind of pristine wilderness experience that had drawn him to Alaska in the first place. Around 10:30 a.m., while following a game trail through a dense stand of spruce trees, Kellerman encountered another person in an area where human presence was extremely rare. The individual was dressed in an identical park ranger uniform, complete with the same equipment and gear that Kellerman carried. From a distance, the figure appeared to be another ranger conducting similar survey work, though no other personnel were scheduled to be in this remote section of the park. As Kellerman approached to make contact with what he assumed was a colleague, he experienced a moment of profound disorientation that would haunt him for years to come. The other ranger was not just wearing similar equipment and uniform, but was identical to Kellerman in every physical detail. Same height, same build, same facial features, even the same small scar on his left hand from a childhood accident. He was looking at himself, standing 30 feet away in the Alaskan wilderness. The doppelganger noticed Kellerman's approach and turned to face him with a smile that was perfectly familiar because it was Kellerman's own smile, reflected back at him from his own face. The duplicate raised his hand in a friendly wave and called out in Kellerman's exact voice, "Beautiful morning for a survey, isn't it, Tom?" The casual use of his nickname, spoken in his own voice, sent chills down Kellerman's spine. Kellerman stood frozen, trying to process what he was seeing while his rational mind searched for explanations. Identical twins, elaborate pranks, psychological breakdown. Anything that might account for encountering a perfect duplicate of himself in the middle of the Alaskan wilderness. But the figure before him was too perfect, too exact in every detail to be explained by conventional means. The duplicate continued the conversation as if nothing unusual was happening, discussing the weather, the caribou herd they'd both been tracking, and the upcoming winter preparations. It spoke with intimate knowledge of Kellerman's work, his personal life, and details that no one else should know. The duplicate mentioned Kellerman's girlfriend Sarah by name, described their recent phone conversation about his mother's health, and referenced private thoughts that Kellerman had never shared with anyone. You're wondering how I know about your conversation with Sarah last night, the duplicate said with Kellerman's own knowing smile. About how you told her you were thinking of proposing when you get back to Anchorage. About the ring you've been carrying in your pack for 3 weeks, waiting for the right moment. The duplicate's knowledge of these intimate details was impossible and terrifying. Kellerman reached for his radio to call for backup, but the duplicate anticipated his movement and spoke before he could transmit. Don't bother calling dispatch, Tom. They won't believe you anyway. How do you explain encountering yourself in the wilderness? How do you describe meeting your own duplicate without sounding completely insane? The duplicate's logic was sound and deeply disturbing. The conversation continued for nearly an hour, with the duplicate demonstrating knowledge that went far beyond what any imposter could possess. It knew about Kellerman's childhood in Montana, his college years studying wildlife biology, his first job with the Forest Service, and every significant event in his personal and professional life. The duplicate even knew about embarrassing moments and private fears that Kellerman had never discussed with anyone. What made the encounter even more unsettling was the duplicate's behavior. It wasn't threatening or hostile, but rather friendly and conversational, as if meeting your exact duplicate in the wilderness was the most natural thing in the world. The duplicate seemed genuinely interested in Kellerman's thoughts and feelings about the encounter, asking questions about his emotional state and psychological reactions with clinical curiosity. This must be quite disturbing for you, the duplicate observed with apparent sympathy. Meeting yourself like this, having your understanding of reality challenged so fundamentally. I imagine you're questioning your sanity, wondering if you're having some kind of breakdown. That's a perfectly normal response to an abnormal situation. Kellerman found himself drawn into the conversation despite his fear and confusion. The duplicate was, after all, himself, and talking to it felt strangely natural, even as it violated every principle of logic and reality he understood. The duplicate's insights into his own psychology were accurate and unsettling, revealing aspects of his personality that he'd never consciously recognized. The turning point in the encounter came when Kellerman asked the duplicate directly what it wanted from him. The duplicate's expression changed, becoming more serious and focused. And when it spoke, its voice carried an undertone of hunger that hadn't been present before. I want your life, Tom. Your job, your girlfriend, your family, your entire existence. I want to be you. Completely and permanently. The casual way the duplicate expressed this desire was more frightening than any threat or display of violence would have been. It spoke of taking over Kellerman's life, with the same tone someone might use to discuss the weather or weekend plans. The duplicate explained that it had been watching Kellerman for months, learning his habits, studying his behavior, and preparing to assume his identity. I know everything about you, Tom. Every memory, every relationship, every detail of your life. I can step into your existence seamlessly, and no one will ever know the difference. Sarah won't know. Your family won't know. Your colleagues won't know. I'll be you, and you'll simply cease to exist. The duplicate's matter-of-fact delivery made the threat even more chilling. Kellerman backed away from the duplicate, his hand moving instinctively toward his sidearm. But the duplicate made no aggressive moves. Instead, it continued talking in that calm, reasonable tone that was so familiar because it was his own voice. Violence won't solve this problem, Tom. You can't shoot yourself, can you? And even if you could, what would you tell people? How would you explain my body? The psychological manipulation was expertly crafted, using Kellerman's own logical thinking patterns against him. The duplicate understood exactly how Kellerman's mind worked, because it was, in some impossible way, the same mind. Every argument Kellerman could make, every action he might take, had already been anticipated and countered by his duplicate. The encounter reached its climax when the duplicate made a proposal that was both generous and terrifying. "I'll give you a choice, Tom. You can walk away from this encounter and pretend it never happened. Go back to your life. Finish your patrol. Return to Anchorage. But know that I'll be watching, waiting, and eventually I'll take what I want anyway. Or you can accept the inevitable now and make this transition easier for both of us." Kellerman chose to flee, turning and running through the forest with a desperation he'd never experienced before. Behind him, he could hear the duplicate calling out in his own voice. "You can't run from yourself forever, Tom. I am you, and you are me, and eventually we'll have to resolve this." The words echoed through the trees, following him as he crashed through the underbrush. The ranger ran for over a mile before stopping to catch his breath and assess his situation. When he looked back, there was no sign of pursuit, no indication that the duplicate had followed him. The forest was silent except for the normal sounds of wildlife and wind through the trees. For a moment, Kellerman wondered if he'd experienced some kind of psychological break, a stress-induced hallucination brought on by isolation and overwork. But when he checked his equipment, he found evidence that the encounter had been real. His GPS device showed that he'd spent over an hour in the location where he'd met the duplicate. Time that was unaccounted for if the experience had been a hallucination. More disturbing, his radio had been switched to a different channel, and his notebook contained entries written in his own handwriting that he didn't remember making. Kellerman completed his patrol and returned to the ranger station. But he never reported the encounter with his duplicate. How could he explain meeting himself in the wilderness without sounding completely insane? Instead, he filed a routine patrol report and tried to convince himself that the experience had been some kind of stress-induced episode. The psychological impact of the encounter was immediate and lasting. Kellerman found himself constantly looking over his shoulder, expecting to see his duplicate watching from the tree line or following at a distance. He became paranoid about his personal security, changing his routines and avoiding predictable patterns that the duplicate might use to track him. Sleep became elusive as Kellerman wrestled with questions about identity and reality that had no satisfactory answers. If the duplicate was real, what was it? Where had it come from? How long had it been watching him? The uncertainty was almost as disturbing as the encounter itself, leaving him in a state of constant anxiety and hypervigilance. Kellerman's relationship with Sarah began to deteriorate as the psychological stress of his experience affected his behavior and emotional state. He became withdrawn and suspicious, unable to explain his changed demeanor without revealing the truth about his encounter. The engagement ring he'd been carrying remained unused as he struggled with questions about whether he was still the same person Sarah had fallen in love with. Months passed without any sign of the duplicate, but Kellerman never stopped feeling like he was being watched and studied. He developed elaborate security measures and constantly varied his routines, but the sense of being observed never left him. The duplicate had gotten inside his head in ways that went far beyond the initial encounter, creating a psychological prison that he couldn't escape. Kellerman eventually requested transfer to a different park, citing personal reasons for needing a change of assignment. He never returned to Denali, but he also never stopped looking over his shoulder, never stopped wondering if the duplicate was still out there, still watching, still waiting for the right moment to claim the life it believed it deserved. The encounter serves as a disturbing reminder that some mysteries in the wilderness challenge not just our understanding of the natural world, but our very sense of self and identity. In the vast emptiness of places like Denali, where isolation and solitude can play tricks on the mind, the line between reality and impossibility becomes dangerously thin. And sometimes we encounter things that force us to question everything we thought we knew about ourselves. Ranger Marcus Webb had been stationed at Great Smoky Mountains National Park for 9 years when he began investigating reports of strange sounds emanating from beneath the forest floor in the remote Cataloochee Valley area. It was October 2021, during the peak autumn season when the mountains blazed with color and thousands of visitors flocked to witness the spectacular fall foliage. But Webb's investigation would take him far from the crowded scenic overlooks into a section of wilderness where something ancient and malevolent seemed to be stirring beneath the earth. The first reports came from experienced backpackers who had been camping in the dispersed camping areas of Cataloochee Valley. Multiple groups, camping on different nights and in different locations, reported hearing rhythmic pounding sounds coming from underground during the late evening hours. The sounds were described as deliberate and mechanical, like massive hammering or construction work taking place deep beneath the forest floor. Webb initially dismissed these reports as misidentified natural phenomena. The Smoky Mountains were geologically active, with underground streams, settling rock formations, and root systems that could create unusual acoustic effects. He'd investigated similar complaints before that turned out to be everything from woodpecker activity to distant construction projects outside the park boundaries. However, the consistency and specificity of the reports began to concern Webb as more witnesses came forward. The sounds were always described as rhythmic pounding, occurring in patterns of 3 strikes followed by a pause, then repeating endlessly throughout the night. Witnesses reported that the sounds seemed to move through the forest floor, traveling from location to location as if something was working its way through an underground network. Webb decided to investigate personally, setting up monitoring equipment in the areas where the sounds had been most frequently reported. He established a base camp in a remote section of Cataloochee Valley, far from any roads or facilities, where he could conduct extended observation without interference from park visitors or normal human activity. On his first night of investigation, Webb experienced the phenomenon firsthand. Around 11 p.m., he began hearing the rhythmic pounding that witnesses had described, emanating from somewhere beneath his campsite. The sound was unmistakably artificial, too regular and purposeful to be natural geological activity. Each series of 3 strikes was perfectly timed, with identical force and duration, suggesting mechanical precision rather than random natural processes. What made the experience particularly unsettling was the way the sound seemed to respond to Webb's presence. When he moved around his campsite, the pounding would shift location, always staying directly beneath wherever he was standing. The sounds followed him with an intelligence that suggested awareness of his movements and position, transforming what should have been random underground activity into something that felt deliberately targeted. Webb attempted to record the sounds using sensitive audio equipment, but discovered that the pounding didn't register on his recording devices despite being clearly audible to his ears. The microphones picked up normal forest sounds, ambient noise, and even Webb's own movements. But the rhythmic pounding that dominated the acoustic environment simply didn't appear on the recordings. The ranger expanded his investigation by bringing in geological survey equipment to examine the subsurface structure of the area. Ground-penetrating radar revealed a complex network of natural caves and underground waterways beneath the forest floor. but nothing that would explain the mechanical pounding sounds. The geological structure was typical for the Appalachian region, with limestone formations and underground drainage systems that had existed for millions of years. On his third night of investigation, Webb made a discovery that transformed his understanding of the phenomenon. The pounding sounds were not random, but were following a specific pattern that corresponded to his movements above ground. When he walked in a straight line, the sounds would follow directly beneath him. When he changed direction, the pounding would shift accordingly, maintaining perfect synchronization with his path through the forest. The realization that something underground was tracking his every movement filled Webb with a primal fear that went beyond rational explanation. The sounds weren't just random underground activity, but represented something with intelligence and purpose, something that was aware of his presence and was deliberately following him through the forest floor. Webb's investigation took a more disturbing turn when he discovered that the pounding sounds were gradually getting closer to the surface. Using seismic monitoring equipment, he determined that the source of the sounds was slowly moving upward through the underground cave system. What had begun as deep underground activity was systematically working its way toward the surface, as if something was tunneling or climbing up from the depths. The psychological impact of spending nights alone in the forest while being tracked by invisible underground activity began to affect Webb's mental state. Sleep became impossible as the pounding continued throughout the night, always directly beneath wherever he tried to rest. The constant awareness of being followed and monitored by something he couldn't see or understand created a level of stress that challenged his ability to continue the investigation. Webb's research into the geological history of the area revealed disturbing information about the Cataloochee Valley region. Historical records from the 1800s documented similar reports of underground sounds described by early settlers as the devil's hammering or spirits working beneath the earth. Native American oral traditions from the Cherokee people included warnings about certain areas of the mountains where the earth itself was said to be alive and malevolent. The historical accounts described incidents remarkably similar to Webb's experience, with witnesses reporting rhythmic pounding sounds that followed them through the forest and seemed to originate from something intelligent moving through underground passages. Several historical accounts mention people who had investigated the sounds too closely and had subsequently disappeared without trace. Their fate unknown, but their absence attributed to whatever dwelt beneath the mountain. On his seventh night of investigation, Webb experienced the most terrifying escalation of the phenomenon. The pounding sounds, which had been gradually moving closer to the surface, suddenly intensified dramatically. The rhythmic hammering became so loud and violent that it shook the ground beneath his feet, causing small rocks and debris to bounce with each impact. The sounds were no longer just following Webb's movements, but seemed to be trying to break through the forest floor directly beneath him. The earth around his campsite began to crack and shift, creating fissures that suggested something large and powerful was attempting to emerge from underground. Webb could feel the vibrations through his boots and see the visual effects of the pounding as the forest floor literally jumped with each impact. The terror reached its peak when Webb realized that the pounding had stopped moving and was now concentrated in a single location directly beneath where he stood. The sounds became a continuous hammering, as if something was desperately trying to break through the final barrier between the underground realm and the surface world. The intensity suggested that whatever was down there was close to achieving its goal. Webb fled the area, abandoning his equipment and investigation as primal survival instincts overrode his professional curiosity. The sounds followed him as he ran through the forest, the pounding moving through the underground passages to track his escape route. Only when he reached his vehicle and drove away from the valley did the sounds finally fade, leaving him shaking and traumatized by the experience. The ranger filed a report classifying the area as geologically unstable and recommended that it be closed to camping pending further geological survey. He never mentioned the intelligent behavior of the sounds or the way they had tracked his movements, focusing instead on potential safety hazards from unstable ground conditions. Webb's investigation equipment, abandoned during his hasty retreat, was never recovered. When he returned to the area weeks later with a full geological survey team, no trace of his campsite or equipment could be found. The forest floor showed no signs of the cracks and disturbances he had witnessed, appearing completely normal and undisturbed. The psychological impact of the investigation persisted long after Webb left the Cataloochee Valley. He developed an aversion to wilderness areas and requested assignment to visitor centers and administrative duties. Colleagues noticed his changed demeanor and reluctance to discuss his geological survey work. But Webb never revealed the true nature of what he had experienced in those underground passages. Reports of rhythmic pounding sounds continue to come from the Cataloochee Valley area, always following the same pattern of intelligent tracking and gradual approach toward the surface. Park services have implemented informal protocols for responding to these reports, emphasizing safety precautions and discouraging extended investigation of the phenomenon. Webb eventually transferred to a different park system, citing personal reasons for needing a change of environment. He continues to research underground acoustic phenomena, but has never returned to investigate similar reports in person. His experience serves as a warning that some mysteries beneath the earth are better left undisturbed, and some sounds from underground should never be followed to their source. The Cataloochee Valley remains open to visitors, but experienced rangers know to avoid certain areas during the night hours when the pounding sounds are most active. Whatever dwells in the underground passages beneath the Smoky Mountains continues its rhythmic work, always listening, always tracking, always trying to find a way to break through to the surface world above. Ranger Daniel Foster had been working the backcountry trails of Zion National Park for 7 years when he experienced something that would challenge his understanding of time, space, and reality itself. It was a scorching July afternoon in 2020, with temperatures soaring above 110 degrees in the desert canyons of southern Utah. Foster was conducting a routine trail maintenance inspection along the remote West Rim Trail, checking for rockfall damage and updating trail condition reports before the peak summer hiking season brought thousands of visitors to the park's most challenging routes. The West Rim Trail was one of Foster's favorite assignments, a strenuous 14-mile trek that wound through some of the most spectacular and isolated terrain in Zion. The trail required serious hiking experience and proper preparation, which meant it attracted fewer casual visitors and provided Foster with a solitude he'd come to appreciate during his years in the Park Service. He knew every mile of the trail intimately, having hiked it hundreds of times in all seasons and weather conditions. Foster began his inspection at the Lava Point trailhead, working his way systematically along the established route while documenting trail conditions, marking hazards, and photographing areas that would require maintenance attention. The work was routine and familiar, following procedures he'd performed countless times over the years. The trail followed its expected path through ponderosa pine forests, across exposed sandstone ridges, and down into the dramatic canyon systems that made Zion famous worldwide. Around mile marker 6, Foster noticed something unusual about his progress along the trail. Despite hiking for over 3 hours at his normal pace, his GPS device indicated that he was still at the same location where he'd been an hour earlier. Initially, he attributed this to equipment malfunction, a common occurrence in the desert environment where extreme temperatures and electromagnetic interference could affect electronic devices. Foster continued hiking, but began paying closer attention to his surroundings and progress markers. The trail landmarks he was passing should have indicated steady progress toward his destination. But instead, he found himself repeatedly encountering the same distinctive rock formations, the same twisted juniper trees, and the same scenic overlooks that he'd photographed earlier in the day. The realization that he was somehow hiking in circles came gradually, as Foster began to recognize specific details that he'd documented earlier in his inspection. A particular lightning-struck tree, a distinctive rock cairn, a section of trail erosion that he'd photographed and GPS marked for repair work. These landmarks were appearing in the same sequence, at the same intervals, as if he was retracing his steps along the exact same section of trail. Foster stopped hiking and carefully examined his surroundings, trying to understand how he could be lost on a trail he knew better than his own neighborhood. The West Rim Trail was well marked and followed a clear, established route with minimal opportunities for wrong turns or navigation errors. Yet somehow, he was trapped in what appeared to be a repeating loop of the same trail section. The psychological impact of the realization was immediate and disturbing. Foster had spent his entire career in wilderness areas, priding himself on his navigation skills and intimate knowledge of park trail systems. The idea that he could become lost on his home trail, in an area he'd hiked hundreds of times, challenged his professional competence and personal identity as an experienced outdoorsman. Foster attempted to break the loop by deliberately leaving the established trail and hiking cross-country toward landmarks he could see in the distance. But no matter which direction he traveled or how far he hiked from the trail, he would inevitably find himself back on the same section of path, encountering the same sequence of landmarks in the same order. The sun's position in the sky became another source of confusion and growing terror. Despite hiking for what felt like many hours, the sun remained fixed at the same angle, casting identical shadows and creating the same lighting conditions that Foster had observed when he first noticed the looping phenomenon. Time itself seemed to be trapped in the same repetitive cycle that held him prisoner on the trail. Foster's attempts to contact park headquarters via radio were unsuccessful, but not because of equipment failure or poor reception. His radio functioned normally, picking up routine park communications and weather reports. But every transmission he made seemed to vanish into the void, without acknowledgement or response. It was as if he existed in a parallel version of the park, where he could observe normal operations, but couldn't interact with them. The psychological stress of the situation intensified as Foster realized that his water and food supplies weren't being depleted despite hours of strenuous hiking in extreme heat. His water bottles remained full, his energy bars uneaten, his physical condition unchanged from when he'd first entered the loop. The normal processes of time and physical exertion seemed suspended within the boundaries of his trapped existence. Foster began experimenting with different approaches to escaping the loop, trying to understand the rules that governed his strange predicament. He attempted hiking the trail section in reverse, taking different rest stops, varying his pace, and even trying to damage or alter the trail markers to see if changes would persist through the loop cycles. Nothing he did seemed to affect the fundamental repetition of his experience. The most disturbing aspect of the time loop was the gradual realization that Foster was not alone in his predicament. As he repeated the same trail section for what felt like the 100th time, he began noticing signs of other hikers who seemed to be trapped in similar loops. Footprints that appeared and disappeared, voices calling from just out of sight, and glimpses of movement that vanished when he tried to investigate. Foster encountered another hiker, a woman in her 30s who appeared to be experiencing the same disorientation and confusion that he was feeling. She introduced herself as Lisa, an experienced backpacker from Colorado who had been hiking the West Rim Trail when she became trapped in what she described as the same damn mile of trail for an indeterminate period of time. Lisa's experience mirrored Foster's in disturbing detail. She had been hiking for what felt like days or weeks, encountering the same landmarks in the same sequence, unable to make progress toward her destination or return to her starting point. Like Foster, she found that her supplies never depleted and her physical condition remained constant despite continuous exertion. The two trapped hikers compared their experiences and discovered that they were both reliving the same section of trail, but from different starting points within the loop. Lisa would appear at the beginning of Foster's loop cycle just as he was reaching the end of his, creating a pattern where they would encounter each other briefly before the cycle reset and separated them again. Foster and Lisa attempted to work together to escape the loop, trying coordinated efforts to break free from the repetitive cycle. They experimented with hiking together, splitting up to cover more ground, and attempting to create permanent changes to the trail environment that might disrupt the loop mechanism. Nothing they tried had any lasting effect on their situation. The psychological toll of the endless repetition began to affect both hikers' mental state. The constant familiarity of their surroundings, combined with the inability to make any meaningful progress or change their situation, created a form of psychological torture that challenged their sanity and will to continue trying to escape. Foster's breakthrough came when he realized that the loop could only be broken by abandoning his attachment to the trail entirely. Instead of trying to hike along established paths or reach familiar destinations, he needed to embrace the unknown and walk directly into the wilderness areas that his ranger training had taught him to avoid. The escape attempt required Foster to overcome every instinct and training protocol he'd developed during his career. He walked away from the trail into unmarked wilderness, ignoring his GPS device, abandoning his planned route, and trusting his survival to pure instinct rather than established procedures. The psychological difficulty of deliberately getting lost was almost as challenging as the physical demands of cross-country desert hiking. Foster's escape from the time loop came suddenly and without warning. After hiking for what felt like hours through unmarked terrain, he suddenly found himself back on the familiar West Rim Trail, but in a different location than where he'd been trapped. His GPS device showed normal function, his radio communications were restored, and the sun had moved to its expected position for the time of day. The ranger completed his trail inspection and returned to park headquarters, but he never reported the time loop experience in his official documentation. How could he explain being trapped in a repeating cycle of the same trail section without sounding completely insane? Instead, he filed a routine maintenance report and tried to convince himself that the experience had been some kind of heat-induced hallucination. Foster continued working at Zion National Park, but he never again hiked the West Rim Trail alone. He developed new protocols for backcountry work that emphasized constant communication with headquarters and mandatory check-in procedures designed to prevent anyone from becoming lost or trapped in remote areas. His colleagues noticed his increased caution and changed approach to wilderness work. But Foster never explained the reasons for his new procedures. The time loop phenomenon continues to be reported by hikers in various national parks, always involving experienced outdoors people who become trapped in repeating cycles of familiar trails. Park services have developed informal protocols for responding to these reports, but the official position remains that such experiences are likely caused by dehydration, heat exhaustion, or other medical conditions that can affect perception and memory. Foster eventually transferred to visitor services, citing a desire for new challenges. But those who knew him recognized that his passion for backcountry work had been fundamentally changed by some unexplained experience. He continues to work in the park system, but avoids solo assignments in remote areas, haunted by the memory of being trapped in an endless cycle where time itself became his enemy. The West Rim Trail remains one of Zion's most popular challenging hikes, but experienced rangers know to watch for signs of hikers who may be experiencing disorientation or confusion about their location and progress. Some loops in the wilderness are more than just circular trails, and some paths lead to destinations that exist outside the normal flow of time and space. Ranger Captain Rebecca Stone had dedicated 23 years of her life to protecting America's wilderness areas when she encountered something that would force her to question everything she thought she knew about what lurked in the deepest, most remote corners of our national forests. It was her final week before retirement from Olympic National Park in Washington State, a career-ending assignment that was supposed to be a peaceful transition into civilian life. Instead, it became the most terrifying experience of her professional life, and a stark reminder that some things in the wilderness are better left undiscovered. Stone had been assigned to conduct a comprehensive survey of the park's most remote backcountry areas, documenting trail conditions and wildlife populations for the incoming ranger staff. The assignment was considered an honor, a recognition of her decades of service and intimate knowledge of Olympic's vast wilderness areas. She knew these forests better than anyone, having spent over 2 decades patrolling every trail, investigating every incident, and protecting both visitors and wildlife in one of America's most pristine wilderness preserves. The survey took Stone into the deepest sections of the Hoh rainforest, areas so remote that they rarely saw human visitors and remained largely unchanged since the park's establishment. These ancient forests, with their massive old-growth trees and dense canopy that blocked most sunlight, represented wilderness in its purest form. Stone had always found peace in these cathedral-like groves. But during her final survey, she began to feel something she'd never experienced before: the unmistakable sensation of being watched. The feeling began subtly on her first day in the deep forest, a slight unease that she initially attributed to the natural hypervigilance that came with solo wilderness work. But as the days progressed, the sensation intensified into a constant awareness of unseen observation that made her skin crawl and her nerves stay perpetually on edge. Something was tracking her movements through the forest, staying just out of sight, but maintaining constant surveillance of her activities. Stone's decades of experience had taught her to trust her instincts in the wilderness. The feeling of being watched was too persistent and too specific to dismiss as paranoia or imagination. Whatever was observing her possessed intelligence and purpose, following her with the patience and skill of an apex predator studying its prey. The psychological pressure of constant observation began to affect her sleep, her appetite, and her ability to focus on her survey work. On her 3rd day in the remote forest, Stone began catching glimpses of movement in her peripheral vision. Massive shapes would shift between the enormous tree trunks, always just beyond clear sight, but large enough to suggest something far bigger than any known wildlife in the region. When she would turn to look directly, nothing would be visible, but the sense of presence remained overwhelming and undeniable. The movements were too large and too coordinated to be explained by known animals. Olympic National Park was home to black bears, elk, and mountain lions, but none of these species moved with the size and deliberate intelligence that Stone was observing. Whatever was tracking her through the forest was something else entirely. Something that didn't fit into any category of wildlife she'd encountered during her long career. Stone's training and experience told her to document everything she observed. But the entity seemed to understand her attempts at evidence gathering and would vanish whenever she reached for her camera or tried to record its presence. The intelligence behind this behavior was sophisticated and unsettling, suggesting awareness of human technology and deliberate efforts to avoid documentation. The psychological warfare intensified when Stone realized that the entity was not just watching her, but was actively influencing her behavior. It would position itself to block certain paths, forcing her to take alternate routes through the forest. It would create disturbances that drew her attention in specific directions, guiding her movements according to some unknown agenda. She was no longer conducting an independent survey, but was being herded through the forest by something with its own purposes. On her 5th day in the deep forest, Stone finally encountered the entity directly. She was documenting a grove of ancient cedars when she became aware of a presence directly behind her. When she turned around, she found herself face to face with something that challenged every assumption she'd held about the natural world and humanity's place within it. The entity was massive, standing nearly 9 feet tall with proportions that suggested both human and animal characteristics. Its form seemed to shift and blur at the edges, as if it existed partially in this reality and partially in some other dimension. Most disturbing were its eyes, which held an intelligence that was ancient, alien, and utterly without compassion for human concerns or survival. Stone stood frozen as the entity studied her with those terrible eyes, examining her with the clinical interest of a scientist observing a laboratory specimen. The encounter lasted only moments. But in that brief time, Stone understood that she was in the presence of something that had been watching human activity in these forests for far longer than humans had been keeping records. This was not a chance encounter, but a deliberate revelation. A decision by the entity to show itself to her for reasons she couldn't comprehend. The entity spoke without words, communicating directly into Stone's mind with thoughts that carried the weight of centuries and the cold indifference of something that viewed humans as temporary intruders in its ancient domain. It conveyed that rangers like Stone were tolerated as long as they respected boundaries, and didn't venture too deeply into areas that belonged to older inhabitants of the forest. Stone understood that she had crossed one of those boundaries during her survey, penetrating too deeply into territory that was claimed and protected by entities that predated human civilization. Her final week before retirement had brought her into contact with something that most people would never encounter and hopefully never need to fear. The entity's message was clear. Some areas of the wilderness were not meant for human exploration, and some watchers in the forest were not bound by the natural laws that governed ordinary wildlife. The encounter ended as suddenly as it had begun, with the entity simply vanishing from sight as if it had never been there. But Stone knew that it was still watching, still present, still evaluating whether she posed a threat to its ancient territory. The remainder of her survey was conducted under constant observation, with the entity's presence a persistent reminder of how little humans truly understood about the wilderness they claimed to protect. Stone completed her final assignment and retired from the National Park Service without ever reporting her encounter with the entity. How could she document something that challenged the fundamental assumptions underlying wildlife management and park protection? Instead, she filed routine survey reports and tried to process the implications of what she'd experienced during her decades of service. The psychological impact of the encounter persisted long after Stone's retirement. She found herself unable to enjoy wilderness areas that had once brought her peace and fulfillment. The knowledge that ancient entities watched from the shadows of every forest made it impossible for her to experience nature with the same innocence and wonder that had originally drawn her to Park Service. Stone's experience represents the culmination of a career spent protecting wilderness areas, only to discover that the wilderness had its own protectors who operated according to rules and purposes that humans could never fully understand. Her encounter with the entity that watches serves as a reminder that our national parks preserve not just natural beauty and wildlife habitat, but also mysteries that are far older and more complex than we can imagine. After hearing these 11 accounts from rangers across America, there's something you need to understand about the wilderness that no guidebook will ever tell you. The forests, mountains, and remote valleys of our national parks are not empty spaces waiting for human exploration. They are ancient realms with their own inhabitants, their own rules, and their own purposes that existed long before we arrived and will continue long after we're gone. If you venture into the deep wilderness, respect the boundaries that aren't marked on any map. Trust your instincts when something feels wrong. If you hear voices calling for help in the darkness, if you find staircases leading nowhere, if you discover clearings that shouldn't exist, document them if you can, but never investigate alone. Some mysteries are warnings, and some discoveries are meant to remain hidden. The rangers who shared these experiences did so not to frighten you away from nature, but to prepare you for the reality that wilderness is far more complex and dangerous than most people realize. Respect the forest, respect the darkness, and always remember that you are a visitor in realms where older things have prior claim. These stories need to be heard, and your experiences matter. If you're a park ranger, wilderness guide, or outdoor enthusiast who has encountered something unexplainable in the wilderness, your story could save lives and help others understand what really exists in our most remote places. Subscribe to Verified Fears and become part of a community that refuses to ignore the truth about what lurks in the shadows. Hit that notification bell because every week we bring you closer to understanding the mysteries that authorities want to keep hidden. Share this video with anyone who spends time in the wilderness. They deserve to know what they might encounter when the sun goes down and civilization feels impossibly far away. The forest is listening, and now you know what's listening back. Your survival might depend on remembering these warnings when you're alone in the wilderness and something that shouldn't exist decides to make itself known. Stay safe out there, and never forget that some places in the wild are meant to remain wild forever.